how did Enlightenment ideals of liberty and equality coexist with the rise of European colonial empires? And can the ethical contradictions of the period be reconciled historically? Right. Thank you for your attention to the matter. Yes, sir. So, Enlightenment ideals of liberté, égalité, fraternité, laïcité. That's the French Revolution, but this all comes from the so-called European Enlightenment, where you have liberty and equality. But how can liberty and equality coexist with slavery? Is what Nirvana Shanks is asking, right? So these ideals, liberty, equality, they actually coexisted with European imposed slavery on all these so-called colonies because of very clever ideas. See, many thinkers in Europe, they narrowed down the classification of who counted as fully human or who counted as citizens. So these principles, liberté, égalité, liberty, equality, they sound like they're universal principles, right? But these Europeans then turned these principles into selective rights by tweaking what is the meaning, by tweaking the definition of the term human and the term citizen. Okay, so before we proceed to colonial empires, let's talk about European society. So many of these Enlightenment writers, okay, what did they say? All men are equal. Now, what happens to women? Women, what happens? Nothing. Women don't exist. Women are subordinate. Women are non-persons in European society, Christian society. That's how it was. I kid you not. And when they said that all men are equal, they applied that to men who had property, men who had wealth, not the riffraff, not the the peasants who toiled on a feudal lord's property. No, not those people. The males, the European males who are wealthy and who have property, they are the ones who are equal. So even in European society, there was not this did not apply equally to all human beings. Women were not part of this term, this statement that all men are equal. And even when it comes to men, it only applied to people who had wealth and property, and it certainly did not apply to colonized people. Okay, so the empires could claim that they gave rights to people at home, males at home, but they could deny those rights abroad. So the Europeans had these fantastic ideas about what it means to be a civilization, what it means to be civilized. They had ideas about civilization, they had ideas about race, they had ideas about historical stages of development. So certain populations are essentially prehistoric, or they are not sufficiently developed to be called civilized people, for example. They are too backward, or they're too brown, or they're too black, or whatever, right? Or they're not Christian enough, or they're not Christian at all, so they can't be called civilized, that sort of thing. So by introducing such nuances, they could portray colonized populations of territories they had grabbed. They could portray the populations as people who are not yet ready for full equality, full liberty, right? So by doing this, they were able to justify conquest. They were able to justify forced labor. They were able to justify this paternalistic attitude of the Europeans as steps towards eventually reaching an allegedly higher European standard of civilization, right? You will also know that the Americans, they had a constitution. They have a constitution, right? Whatever it says, it calls the natives as what? Savages. No, that's the Declaration of Independence. The US Declaration of Independence, if you read it, it portrays the natives as savages. But the Americans have a constitution, and this constitution was allegedly ratified by the people of America. But was it? Well, it wasn't ratified by women. It wasn't ratified by by the natives. It wasn't ratified by the enslaved African American people. It wasn't even ratified by white men who did not have property. So, that's the kind of game they would play. So they created cultures, they created societies, okay, in which the freedom, in which not everyone was a citizen. And freedom was for those who were called citizens, was built upon the slavery of those who had been conquered and enslaved, and who would do all the labor for the so-called citizens. So that's how it was. You see, so non-Europeans had to be first educated. And how do you educate someone? Through hard labor, so that they can, become more attuned with the European way of doing things, so on. So that's how it was. It was all racism. It was all justification for conquest, for slavery, for genocide, for forced displacement, for ethnic cleansing, for having millions of people work as slaves while you enjoy the benefits of that, right? So that all came out of enlightenment. So these thoughts that came out, these thoughts and slogans and ideas that came out of the so-called enlightenment or enlightenment thought, they actually gave the Europeans tools for legitimizing slavery, for legitimizing genocide and whatnot. Can we reconcile these ethical contradictions of this period historically? Well, how do you reconcile these contradictions? Right? You can't. It cannot be justified. You can perhaps contextualize it. You can say that whatever happened was a product of economic interests of the Europeans. It was a product of the entrenched racism, inherent, deep-rooted racism of the Europeans, and it was consequences of the limited notions, the limited ideas of what counted as a citizen, or even among the subjects, what counted as a person who had some kind of rights or did not have rights, right? So it's this entire period, the so-called colonial period, the period of the destruction of the world by the Europeans, it is a history of rapacious occupation, rapacious plunder, and domination of people, millions, hundreds of millions of people, dressed in the language of progress. Okay, they used the terminology, the vocabulary of rights, of equality, of self-determination, human rights, democracy today, same way. And they used it to justify their domination and all the abuses and atrocities they did. So you can't reconcile these things. And the same kind of attitude persists today. Today they will give you slogans about human rights and freedom and democracy while being the worst abusers of human rights and freedom and democracy. Nothing really has changed. Well, there we have it. Okay.